And then
Couple quick questions.
this is my favorite part, just saying.
Is it possible for us to find like the live stream link if we want to send it out to people?
It's you can do that right in the top left where it says on YouTube. If you just click on that, you can copy the streaming link.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then can you just email Kane right now before the round? You want to share evidence or just during the round?
Yeah, I'll make it now. And I have your email, so I'll just like remake it, I suppose.
All right, so we are now live online with this round. So congratulations again to everyone for making it to semifinals. Claire, I'm going to drop out of the audio. You were the co-host, so you should be good from here. Let Tab know if there's any problems. Thank you.
All right, can do.
I sent out the chain. So once y'all get it, I'm good to go.
And then let us know when you guys are all ready to go, and then we'll get the okay from judges as well.
All right. Zana and I are pro, and I think we're good to go. So is everybody else ready to start?
Is it all right if I just run to the bathroom really quick, actually?
Please run to the bathroom.
Thank you. All right, I'm good. Thanks for waiting.
All right. Are we all good to start then? Awesome. Sounds great. We affirm resolved. The NSA should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. Our sole contention is that NSA surveillance leads to abuse of power. Subpoint A is that the NSA enables government agencies to circumvent the law. In the status quo, the NSA has the ability to collect massive amounts of information with minimal oversight. As Noah Yatchett, a senior editor for the American Civil Liberties Union, finds in 2017, quote, "The National Security Agency collects vast amounts of phone calls, emails, text messages, and more from Americans communicating with people overseas, often sweeping up domestic communications in the process, all without individualized warrants from a court. Government agencies can then search through that data for information about anyone in a subversion of judicial protections meant to prevent abuse of government powers," end quote. Information collected in the NSA's database is accessed by law enforcement agencies to conceal all kinds of investigations, as according to Trevor Aronson, a security fellow at New America in 2019, quote, "A growing body of evidence suggests that the federal government is deliberately concealing methods used by intelligence or law enforcement agencies to identify or investigate suspects, including methods that may be illegal. It does so by creating a different story about how agents discovered the information. Prosecutors assist law enforcement agents in concealing the origin of investigations by telling judges and defense lawyers that they are not required to find out if certain agencies, including the NSA, were involved in the case," end quote. Unfortunately, the FBI takes advantage of this practice of using the NSA's database to work around the law. As Kieran McCarthy, a governance journalist at the Register, finds in 2019, quote, "Giving the FBI virtually unrestricted access to the NSA database led to exactly the sort of behavior that people were concerned about. Vast numbers of searches, including many that were not remotely justified. The FBI was using the NSA's database at least 80 times more frequently than the NSA itself," end quote. The FBI having the ability to search through this database is tremendously harmful. This is because subpoint B is NSA surveillance can be used to unequally target people. The NSA has been known to use its powers of surveillance to disproportionately target minorities and political opponents. As Jesselyn Radick, a national security and human rights director for the Government Accountability Project in 2014 finds, quote, "The National Security Agency and FBI have covertly monitored the emails of prominent Muslim Americans under secretive procedures intended to target terrorists and foreign spies. Harkening back to its domestic spying roots of spying on civil rights leaders, the FBI and NSA have been specifically targeting people for surveillance based on their race, religion, and constitutionally protected speech," end quote. This kind of biased targeted surveillance creates the risk that NSA surveillance can be exploited for political purposes. As Kate Martin, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, The Hill, finds in 2017, quote, "There is a real possibility that the instruments of government power, rather than being used to enforce the law and protect national security, will be employed for the political benefit of those in power by targeting political opponents and groups based on their religion, ethnicity, and race," end quote. We cannot allow the government to continue to hold this power. As according to Noah Yatchett previously cited, quote, "We should apply skepticism whenever the government cries national security to flout our system of checks and balances. No one should rest easy knowing that our intelligence agencies have these powers and are using them," end quote. Ultimately, when a lack of oversight and the ability to disproportionately target certain groups are combined, it creates a system where the right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment is at risk. As according to the Human Rights Watch in 2018, quote, in creating fictions to keep potentially questionable investigative activities out of sight, the government avoids an important deterrent to official misconduct. If government agents can potentially create privacy-violating, discriminatory, or otherwise unlawful programs or patterns of behavior in secret without facing negative consequences, the rights of every member of the public are in jeopardy," end quote. Therefore, in order to help ensure that every American receives justice and equal protection under the law, we affirm.
Skylar, do you need cards or no?
I'm good for now.
Okay. Everybody good for the neg? Fantastic. We negate contention 1 is terrorism. Deaths from terror worldwide are decreasing. The Institute for Economics and Peace in 2020 finds deaths from terrorism fell for the 5th consecutive year since peaking in 2014. However, COVID-19 could enable a resurgence of terrorism. As UNSC in 2020 indicates, the population is spending more time online. The increased number of young people engaging in unsupervised internet usage offers terrorist groups an opportunity to expose a greater number of people. In fact, the terror threat has turned local. As Victor Beattie, a reporter for VOA in 2015 indicates, the fight against global terrorism has entered a new phase, with groups using social media to inspire others to join them or launch domestic attacks. Specifically, the NSA surveillance stops terror plots through metadata collection. As Nathan Sales, associate professor of law at Syracuse University, writes in 2014, the government collecting bulk data and then examines it to identify previously unknown terrorists. Authorities compile large amounts of information and use it to map the social networks of known terrorists and thus identify associates with whom they may be conspiring. Furthermore, NSA programs conserve scarce investigative resources by ruling out involvements in plots. Furthermore, The existence of the NSA surveillance deters terror attacks in the first place. As Samuel Raskoff, assistant professor of law at NYU, writes in 2014, the mere fact of prosecution can alter terrorist perceptions of future successes by implying a pervasive surveillance network facilitated by technology. It creates an overwhelming perception that terrorists are unlikely to evade the widespread surveillance. That's critical, as we are constantly being targeted. As James Lewis, senior fellow for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, writes in 2014, attacks have been planned or attempted against American targets every year since 9/11. Ultimately, Matthew Olson, the former director for the NSA, writes in 2017, quote, they identified 30 cases in which Section 702 information was the initial catalyst that identified previously unknown terrorist operatives. Section 702 led to the arrest of more than 100 individuals on terrorism-related offenses. The impact is a chemical attack. As Richard Strobel, former intelligence agent at the FBI and CIA, writes in 2018, that there is a very real risk of the Islamic State using chemical materials as weapons of terror against the West. That would kill millions. As Senator Susan Collins writes in 2005, 2.4 million people could be killed. Contention 2 is cybersecurity. The NSA will use internet surveillance to stop cyber attacks. As Frank Conkle, the executive director of NextGov, writes in 2019, the NSA gobbled up communications and surveillance data to monitor real-time internet activity and cyber threats. Intel collection is critical to stopping cyber attacks for two reasons, and the first is malware detection. Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School writes in 2013 that telecom networks are the channels through which malware typically traveled. To keep these secure, the government needs powerful intelligence capabilities so that it can learn about planned cyber intrusions. The second is attribution. Jonathan Mayer, assistant professor at Princeton University, writes in 2015, quote, the NSA can use internet surveillance to attribute a cybersecurity threat to another nation. That keeps any cyber attacks below a potential response threshold, as John Lindsay, assistant professor at the University of California, writes in 2015. Cyber attackers intentionally keep the cost they inflict below the assessed threshold of even a limited military retaliation by opponents. The impact is preventing the next power outage, as NSA surveillance is critical to preventing attacks on grids. Gorman in 2010 indicates that federal government is launching an expansive program to detect cyber assaults on the electricity grid. That's critical, as Maggie Miller, a cybersecurity reporter for Vox, writes in 2020 that foreign hackers were zeroing in on critical infrastructure. The impact could be devastating. As John Skor, former Coast Guard and Vice Admiral, writes in 2019 that a successful attack on a major portion of the US grid would have widespread, disruptive, and deadly effects. In such situations, a large number of deaths are likely and a societal breakdown will occur in 1 week. In fact, Paul Bedard of the Washington Examiner in 2019 concludes 9 out of 10 Americans would die. America would cease to exist in the events of a mass power outage. Thus, Winigate.
Okay, real quick before constructive, can we get a little bit of evidence?
Yep.
I think in your contention 2 under attribution, is it Gorman, assaults on the power grid are like likely or probable, something like that? And then
Gorman is NSA protects grids.
yeah, that one.
Miller, okay.
Yeah, the Miller. Yeah.
Gorman or Miller?
Both, please.
Okay. Is that it?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
And we'll start as soon as we get it.
Can I actually call for the evidence that says that the FBI takes advantage of sort of this parallel construction?
Yep.
Great, thank you.
All right, I just sent it.
All right, we got it. Did you guys want to wait until you got the FBI one to start cross, or do you just want to start now?
We'll wait.
Okay.
Okay, there are 2 cards. Yeah, we use 2 cards, so I sent both of them.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
I'll let you know when I get it. Okay, I just got it. You all are good to start cross.
All right, you can have the first whenever you're ready.
All right. So if the NSA is so great at identifying and deterring domestic terrorist attacks, where was the NSA during the Nashville bombing during the storming of the Capitol?
So basically, the storming of the Capitol is a slightly different example where there wasn't as much information about that going in, and it was mainly inspired by a speech Donald Trump gave at the start of it. Second of all, yes, there have been instances in which some attacks slip through. It is not a perfect system, but the reality is that we've prevented over 30 attacks. So it's comparatively better to have 2 examples of a terror attack as opposed to like 30 Boston bombings, which would happen without the NSA.
And then if I could just have a quick follow-up, are those
Sure.
30 terror attacks specific to American citizens?
Yes.
All right, thanks.
Can I have a question, please?
Yeah, if we could get that evidence after cross though.
For sure. Okay. So, let's talk about the FBI. If the NSA goes away just entirely, is the FBI just going to stop kicking down people's doors without due process?
The FBI won't cease to exist. It won't cease to do some of the things. What we're saying uniquely happens when we get rid of the NSA is that the FBI isn't able to use this system of taking from the NSA's database and then not citing their source.
Okay, so let's look at this historically. The war on drugs has been happening since the 1970s, way before electronic mass surveillance. The FBI has been violating people's 14th Amendment rights and 4th Amendment rights for 5 decades. Is the NSA uniquely going to stop that?
Well, I'm actually glad you mentioned that because the FBI, like this also is used by the DEA on the war on drugs. It'll use NSA information to try
but
to
it was
target people.
yes, but the war on drugs was happening decades before this started, which means
I know.
that if the NSA goes away, people's doors are still getting kicked down. The DEA and the FBI keep violating people's rights. Where's the
No,
unique
what we're
difference
saying,
from the
what we're
NSA?
saying right now is this is what's continuing to enable it. The fact that they don't have to cite it, that they're
that's
continuing to
just,
prosecute this
like
way.
ahistorical, given that we saw it happen way before this happens. You can't say they can't operate without the NSA when they factually did operate without the NSA for 30 years.
We're not saying that they can't operate at all without the NSA. We're saying
Okay, so
specifically they're
they
not
can-
using the system they're using now.
Okay, so they continue to violate people's rights with or without the NSA.
We're going in circles here. Can I please have a question?
Wait, no, but can I? Okay, yeah, you can have a question. That's fine.
Okay. So on this idea of cybersecurity specifically, you say that the NSA needs to be in there to monitor the internet to detect these attacks, correct?
Yep.
Is your argument that when we get rid of the NSA, specifically surveillance on Americans, all American cybersecurity goes away?
Yes. That the
Okay, so-
ability for the NSA to collect information about like malware detection goes away. The ability for them to attribute cyber attacks to actors all go away.
So you're saying that Cybercom and the CISA have absolutely no role? in
Neither
US
of those
security?
play roles in the attribution of attacks. They just
All right,
don't.
thank
They're
you.
all defensive mechanisms. That's
All right.
basically cross. Like if you just want to run it out. All right. Are y'all taking prep?
Yep, we'll take prep as soon as I mute.
Fantastic.
All right, that's 55 seconds used. Is everybody ready? Awesome. Then I will begin. Look to their first contention on terrorism. I'm going to be going line by line. There are 5 responses. Start with their sales 14 evidence. One response here. The NSA isn't effective at counterterrorism. According to Bailey Cahill from New America in 2014, quote, an in-depth analysis of 225 individuals inspired by Al-Qaeda's ideology or like-minded group since 9/11 demonstrate that traditional investigative methods, such as use of informants, tips from local communities, and targeted intelligence operations provided the initial impetus for investigations in the majority of cases, while the contribution of NSA's bulk surveillance programs to these cases was minimal, end quote. All they're doing is sprouting some theory from 2014. Our evidence from 2014 is away from the NSA. It's an independent study that analyzed a much broader sample size and found that the NSA was extremely minimal, that their contribution was extremely minimal. Overall, they can't do very much. But then go to the Lewis 14 evidence. Then go to the Raskoff working evidence. One response here. This is due to warranted surveillance. When they say that terrorists are afraid of being prosecuted and such, it's not because of mass surveillance overall, because mass surveillance overall hasn't stopped them. It's because of our targeted investigations that stopped the vast majority of terrorist attacks. Then go to their Lewis evidence. One response here. This is outdated. This is extremely important because even if in 2014 attacks were planned every single year against the United States, that's not the same today. We haven't seen a major terrorist attack in years and years. It's really not a threat. But then go to their Olson evidence that says that 30 cases where Section 702 were used. One response here. There is no connection to domestic surveillance. This is critical. They read Section 702. Section 702 is about foreign surveillance. At the point where we're ending domestic surveillance if we affirm, there's no reason why our international surveillance would not continue. But then, look to their Strobel evidence. One response here. We can still stop this with NSA surveillance. Even if ISIS in 2020, even where they still aren't even a threat, even if they were trying to get a chemical weapon, we can still stop that because international surveillance continues, and domestically we have targeted surveillance, which solves the entire issue overall. At that point, they really don't have an impact. But then go to contention 2 on cybersecurity. There are 3 main responses here. First, turn the arguments. Unwelcome NSA surveillance fosters distrust, weakening cybersecurity. According to Brendan Sasso, a technology reporter for The Atlantic in 2014, quotes, most computer networks are run by private companies, and the government must work closely with the private sector to improve cybersecurity. But companies have become reluctant to share security information with the US government, fearing the NSA could use any information to hack into their systems, end quote. This is critical. When they're talking about cybersecurity and being able to identify threats in the future, when the private companies aren't working with the government, that makes it 10 times harder, we are unable to do it. But second, cyber attacks aren't being kept below the threshold. According to David Sanger of the New York Times in 2020, quote, the scope of a hack engineered by one of Russia's premier intelligence agencies became clear on Monday. The State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and parts of the Pentagon had been compromised. The National Security Agency apparently did not know of the breach in the network monitoring software made by SolarWinds until it was notified last week by FireEye, a private security firm, end quote. This is critical. The entire contention to their second subpoint on attribution revolves around the idea of being able to identify an opponent and stop this issue. But that really isn't happening in the status quo because we're seeing major attacks like this one against the departments of our government. Then, on their first work on malware detection, one response here. Other agencies like Cybercom will continue to protect our government and our infrastructure overall. There's no reason to believe that ending domestic surveillance will weaken our cybersecurity overall. Finally, when they reach you this impact card about the adversaries are going to attack our power grid, causing 9 out of 10 people to die, one response here. This is extremely, extremely improbable. At the point where we've apparently had these vulnerabilities and all this happening for a super, super long time, and we've been able to stop this with traditional methods, there's no reason to believe that affirming is going to solve this issue. Overall, we outweigh their contentions in a number of ways, mostly on probability, and that's why we urge you to negate the resolution.
All right, I'd like to see some evidence. So the Bailey 14 card that you read at the top, and then the third and fifth response on terrorism, and your last response on the power grids argument, and your first response on it as well.
Okay, so one. Okay, so you wanted Bailey, then you wanted, my third response was that your evidence is outdated. There was no card read. Just using
Okay, that's fine.
And then on my fifth response is that we can still stop it with NSA surveillance. That was analysis as well. There's no card for that. What else did you want?
In that case, just like so that's all for terror, and then for cybersecurity, first that they're reluctant to share.
Yep.
And then the last response you read about how the power grids aren't vulnerable.
And the last one was analytic as well.
Okay, so there's no evidence on the last piece?
Nope.
All right, so just to clarify, the evidence that you read in cyber was on the first 3 responses, and there wasn't one for the 4th?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just call for the first then.
We did read another piece of evidence on cyber, actually. It was about not being kept below the threshold right now.
Was that just the SolarWinds card?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so if you could just send me whatever evidence you read on the 1st and the 4th, that would be good.
Okay.
Mhm.
I don't think the SolarWinds was the 4th response, but I can
Oh,
check.
sorry, not the SolarWinds one. Just I'm not sure if you read
That was
evidence.
That was an analytic.
Yeah.
Okay, then just the 1st, like from earlier.
Okay, I sent it.
I'll let you know when I receive it. I just got Kahal and Sasso. Are those the only two?
Yes. Then
Okay.
there was SolarWinds, but yeah.
Sounds good. Josh and I are going to call and run prep when we get connected. Starting. All right. That was 32 seconds of prep use. Is everyone ready? Great. So the order of my speech is just going to be going over some rebuilding, and then I'll move on to their case. Perfect. Start on our argument about terrorism. They give you one overarching response that there are empirically no examples of when counterterror has been affected by the NSA. There's a few problems with this. Number one, all of the evidence that they can provide on this issue is extremely old. On the other hand, our Beanie evidence from CASE says that as of most recently, terrorism has shifted to online. So that's why traditional counterterrorism mechanisms and the targeted ones that they're advocating for are ineffective. It's because informants and physical ties are no longer effective insofar as terrorism is being conducted and planned online now, which is why mass surveillance is still necessary. But second of all, you should actually prefer our evidence that says that mass surveillance is effective, because in order to find that targeted counterterror in the first place, you need bulk surveillance to recognize patterns and trends. The next response I give you is that all our evidence is outdated and that we haven't seen a terrorist attack being planned in the status quo. That is exactly our point. The reason that we haven't seen a terrorist attack being planned in the status quo is because the NSA bulk surveillance is effective in doing deterrence and counterterrorism. But second off, we would say that when we have seen the rare occasion of terrorist attacks being planned, we have seen them been blocked by the NSA. There are so many historical examples that flow into our side, like the Kansas City and the New York planned bombing that were all stopped by the NSA. Lastly, they say that we don't solve because it's about foreign surveillance. The problem is that we have given you plenty of examples where we do solve. And secondly, they say themselves that Section 702 incidentally collects the information of American citizens. So we do solve this as well. And then on the cybersecurity argument, their first response is that they're going to be reluctant to share with the private corporations. The problem is that the new director established means there's going to be new trust fosters, and that's why we're actually cooperating with the private sector right now. Then on their argument about how SolarWinds disproves our argument. Number one, this attack that they were trying to name is a completely different scale. It was just hacking into a few personal computer networks of NSA contractors, which just proves our argument that Russia and these other adversaries are staying below the threshold of our power grid. But secondly, we would say this is also an argument for our side, because a week later, the NSA was the one who discovered that SolarWinds had been hacked. Then they say that other sectors are going to fill in. The problem is that number one, all these other sectors are reliant on the NSA signals data, and number two, they'll be overwhelmed with just themselves. Now onto their case. NSA surveillance is the only intelligence capable of doing counterterror and cyber missions, while countless other actors are going to violate constitutional rights. And as they conceded during First Cross, will not stop violating these rights. Affirming is therefore only a net harm. But specifically on their subpoint A, there are countless other sources that worsen the violation of rights even without the NSA. Firstly, the FBI. Matsaki in 2018 explains that law enforcement had used a surveillance tool that behaved like fake cell phone towers because of a non-disclosure agreement with the FBI. Secondly, the DEA, which is an example they name themselves, can do their own violations. The Drug Policy Alliance in 2020 explains that the DEA tracked billions of international phone calls made by US residents, the source of 1/5 of all wiretaps. But thirdly, the Department of Homeland Security will monitor activists specifically with all sorts of other violations as well. Sandra Fulton explains in 2016 that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security spy on activists using facial recognition technology and massive databases, that making it all way too easy. These are critical because they provide alternative options for the parallel construction and constitutional violation they are telling you about. However, because the intentions and targets of these other agencies is not to counter terror, it takes away the only net benefit. So affirming is always going to create harms. But on the subpoint B specifically, the problem here is that number one, bulk data is actually going to create more targeted and more accurate detection. Siegel 15 explains that predictive targeting can balance against subjective human biases, and more precise targeting means fewer innocent individuals considered and monitored. And Watney 17 actually quantifies that AI could reduce jailing by up to 42% with no increase in crime rates. This is critical because it means that this bulk data they're talking about is actually going to be effective in reducing human biases, whereas if you let the police run rampant, then all these subjective biases will fill in. But secondly, our argument about stopping terrorism is going to turn their case, because every time a terrorism attacks, it increases Islamophobia throughout the US. For example, it increased terrorist attacks by 481, or it increased hate crimes against Muslims by 481 last time 9/11 happened. We would say that is a reason you prioritize preventing terrorist attacks from happening.
All right. You good for Cross?
Yeah, you can ask the first question whenever you're ready.
Awesome. So like the first three responses you make about all these other agencies that can continue to surveil, right?
Yes.
How does that respond to the warrant of our entire case, which is that when these agencies conduct investigation with intelligence, they conceal the origins in court? That's the violation of privacy. Where in any of that evidence does it say that these agencies are concealing the origins of their investigation?
Why does if they're still violating constitutional rights, why does it matter in which way they're doing it?
So our entire argument is that when a minority goes to court, the investigation against them was conducted by NSA intelligence, which isn't presented to the defense.
Oh, okay.
Don't even hear about it. So how does anything of that matter?
I'll answer your question. It's because the exact same problem applies to thousands of other agencies. For example, here, I'll explain. May I answer your question?
Yes, sir.
For example, the FBI has non-disclosure agreements to the point where they can take the data and they can go into court in the exact same way and not have to disclose the source of the data. So that is the exact same violation being conducted by the FBI and other agencies like the DEA that you're naming, specifically, like supposedly only the NSA does. We're just saying that other agencies are doing the exact same constitutional violation and will continue to, and even increase it in a world without the NSA.
Okay. So if possible,
can I ask a question though, because we've spent like more than
Sure.
half. All right, so let's talk about your argument on targeting unequal people specifically.
Yes.
So can you give me one example of when the NSA has used this to unjustly target minorities?
Yeah, I can give you 5. So our Radic 14 evidence is talking about how the NSA and FBI uses this.
So the FBI as well.
Yes, so that's what our argument's about.
Okay,
They use the same database to target 5 prominent Muslim leaders. One of them was the founder of CARE, the largest Muslim organization in the United States. And this prohibited one of them, for instance, from visiting their grandmother overseas who died because the Muslim was placed on a terrorist watch list. and there was a whole drama about that, and it was all because of discrimination. Can I have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So on your side of the flow, when we're talking about like cybersecurity and all that, you
Yes.
said that the example of Russia launching a cyber attack, compromising computers in the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and one other agency wasn't a major cyber attack.
Yeah, because it wasn't in our critical infrastructure or power grids. It was simply the networks where we store, for example, like personal information. It has no real tangible
Don't
effect.
we have like the most top secret information in the Pentagon on like our entire
No,
military?
because your evidence about SolarWinds never specifies that it was the classified information that was stolen. It might have simply been administrative information in, for example, the Pentagon, for all we know.
Yeah, because that stuff is classified, but we do know that they had
No, nowhere in your evidence does it say that classified information was stolen.
No, it says
And
that
even if classified information was stolen, we haven't seen any harmful ramifications yet, which proves that the cyber attack was below the threshold of harm. On the other hand, if Russia were to, for say, shut down our power grid, you would see immediately harmful impacts. But that's the end of Crossfire.
Can we see all of the evidence about the DEA, the FBI, what you
Absolutely.
in that sequence? Yep.
Okay, I've sent them.
All right, so we should get it. Let's take some prep. Okay, still haven't gotten it. Oh, okay, got it.
Okay, I sent it, so.
Got it. Okay, we'll take prep as soon as I mute.
Cool. I have another minute 15 use on that.
How much did you take before rebuttal?
It was 50 is on, right? Yeah, okay.
So you have like 50 seconds left?
Yeah,
if I have my
we
math
can
correct?
keep track of our own prep if
Okay.
that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
And then is everybody good to go? Awesome, thank you. All right. Ultimately, this debate has boiled down to three main voting issues. The first is abuse of power, the second is terrorism, and the third is cybersecurity. Now, first on abuse of power, what we've maintained throughout this round is that the reason why the NSA is uniquely bad is because it allows other agencies to query their database and then not have to cite the NSA as the source of their information. Our opponents try to make a bunch of responses here, but they're all basically saying the same thing, that other organizations will continue to do this and will not have to have attribution. The problem with this is what their evidence says is that they don't have to reveal the scope of their actual operations. As long as the FBI is using its own intelligence, it have to reveal that it came from its own organization. Therefore, we can still see that the NSA is uniquely bad in the fact that they don't even have to reveal that this information is coming from the NSA. at the point where there's absolutely no oversight on whether or not these charges being brought forth are actually credible. It's clearly a violation of the 14th Amendment because there's not equal protection and people don't know the charges being brought forth against them. However, the second key thing to remember here is even if injustice might continue with just these organizations alone, it still doesn't justify the fact that this system occurs. The fact that this is being used unjustly to target minorities and possibly political opponents in the future is reason enough to end this program, to end this violation of the 14th Amendment. The second major thing that they try to maintain here is ultimately that technology, whether artificial intelligence or just mass surveillance, makes it ultimately less discriminatory. While we agree that technology itself is less discriminatory, the problem with this argument is it's not what it's being used for. We've shown the FBI has used information specifically to target Muslim Americans. They're drawing from this database in ways that aren't equal. They're targeting people unequally. At this point, we can extend the Human Rights Watch evidence that says when the government's creating these fictions and there's no checks and they can participate in this discriminatory behavior, the rights of everyone are at jeopardy. It's not just to allow the government to unequally target people. Therefore, by affirming, you end a way in which the government does this and a major way in which the government does this. On the second voter of terrorism, there are three major things we need to remember here. First is ultimately that the traditional methods help to solve for this. They try to say that it doesn't apply because they're shifting to online methods. The specific method they cite is social media. There's no reason why traditional methods can't see what's happening on social media. The second thing to remember here is that ultimately this is more about foreign surveillance. Their specific card about protecting broadly against terrorist attacks is from Section 702. While it is true that some domestic information does get caught up in Section 702, if they can't prove that this is the information being used to stop this terrorist attacks, we can't assume that it's surveillance on Americans that's helping this. But the third and most important thing to remember here is ultimately their impact, which they drop, is about chemical weapons. They don't give any likelihood of a domestic terrorist getting chemical weapons. Therefore, we outweigh on probability. But on the third and final voter of cybersecurity, the one main thing to remember here ultimately is that when we end the NSA, cybersecurity doesn't go away. Remember, organizations like Cyber Command still exist to protect our security insofar as they can't prove that we don't have any defenses against hacks. When this goes away, we clearly outweigh on probability and severity, and we affirm.
Okay, we're gonna call on Winston Pratt. Starting. That was 1:15 used. So that puts us at around a little over 30 seconds left.
Okay. It's starting on my contention 2. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Go to my cyber defense contention 2, which is where we are winning the round. What we tell you is that right now there are foreign actors that would want to attack our critical infrastructure like our power grids, but they cannot because they know that the NSA, whenever they get into our power grids, the NSA can track that attack back to them so we know it's them. The reason why that's critical is that now, for example, if Russia tries to get into our grid, but the NSA knows it's Russia, Russia can't do anything because they fear an American military retaliation because now we know it's them. them. None of this is responded to in the previous speech. It's the easiest place to vote because their only response they extend is this argument that other agencies can fill in. First of all, we already responded to this in two ways. First, those agencies rely on the NSA's signals intelligence to do all of their cyber defense. But second, none of those other agencies are able to do what the NSA does as far as tracking intrusions back to their source. Our Mayer evidence is fantastic when it says that the NSA is explicitly unique in what it does when it talks about attribution. The reason why this argument matters more than theirs is because, first of all, on a link-in, if our power grid goes down and America is in mass panic, of course police and the FBI are going to take advantage of that to violate more rights because there's no oversight. But the second thing is that ultimately you're going to prefer death. There are always agencies that are violating our constitutional law, and it is bad, but there is nothing affirming can do about that. Rather, we should prioritize saving American lives, which is ultimately what the Constitution would urge you to do. At that point, it's a really clear negative ballot on this argument. But you could even go to their arguments about constitutional abuse. The main thing they're not responding to is the fact that the FBI does the exact same thing. Their arguments are basically just that the FBI can conceal what they do because they can say, we got it from the NSA and we don't have to tell the courts. They are not responding to our evidence, which says the FBI has their own database, which means that they have their own database, which they have non-disclosure agreements within, which literally mean that they don't have to disclose the source of their own data to the courts, which means that the FBI is violating that exact same constitutional right in either world. That's the second thing, is that the DEA does the exact same thing. But when they do what the DEA does is it wiretaps people, but the court does not ask for necessarily where they got all of that. What you're noticing is the fact that this whole database is not just comprised of the NSA. It's comprised of tons of agencies. Getting rid of one does not stop the FBI from kicking down the door of somebody it wants to attack, because they've been doing it since the 70s. Look to the history of this. We have seen all these things happen in history. At that point, you're just going to want to vote on the fact that a cyber attack could take down the power grid and that would kill 9 out of 10 Americans. It significantly outweighs their argument. You want to prioritize saving American lives over anything else in the round.
Ready for cross?
Yeah, if we could just have a quick second, we get like a feedback issue. We're in the same room. So
Yeah, sure.
we-
No worries.
thank you. Yes. All right. Good to know.
Y'all can have the first whenever you're good.
Awesome. So on this idea of cybersecurity specifically, we understand you guys say the NSA is uniquely important because of attribution, correct?
Yeah.
What piece of evidence do you read anywhere in the round that says that the NSA is the only agency that can attribute these attacks?
Mayor.
Mayor is the one that says the NSA is the agency that does attribution. Moreover, your own evidence indicates that Cyber Command does cyber defense, and that's great. But the reality is that cyber defense doesn't matter. There are so many potential vulnerabilities that Russia or other actors could hack into. What we should prioritize is reducing the incentive for those actors to exploit those vulnerabilities, which means that because the NSA is the only one that does attribution, and because it's empirically worked, we've attributed grid intrusions in 2018 and 2020. And it has stopped these grid attacks, then affirming to take away NSA surveillance does nothing but result in 9 out of 10 Americans
On the
dying.
idea that the NSA is the only one that does attribution, I just like, how is that a true claim when like SolarWinds had to alert NSA to something that to the fact that it was hacked
SolarWinds is the
itself?
company that got hacked. The NSA attributed it a week later.
The NSA did attribute the attack to Russia.
The NSA was the one who released the statement saying that it was Russia.
Yeah.
And SolarWinds is the company that got hacked, not the company that attributed it.
Yeah.
The NSA wasn't even aware of the attack until SolarWinds notified them, correct?
No, the
that's
NSA
not
was
at
the
all
one.
true.
Yeah.
The NSA knows when federal databases have been breached.
Hold on, real quick. On your like Maggie Meyer evidence, it says in the card that CISA the like Cyber Command Infrastructure Agency was part of.
You didn't call for mayor. You called for Miller, which was about other actors zeroing in on the grid. The mayor evidence is
Fire
different.
after this. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Can we have a question though?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So let's talk about like the alternative to the NSA. So the NSA goes away. What happens to law enforcement agencies? Like, what do they do now?
Specifically, they can't draw from the NSA database and then just not reveal when they got their source.
Yeah, so they're going to try to find another method of intelligence, correct?
Yeah, but what
Okay.
we're saying is that's ultimately not allowed. You guys
Okay.
keep talking about these non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah.
And what we say is that in your evidence, it says they don't have to reveal the expanse of the surveillance. They still have to reveal that they are their own source.
But first of all, that is not necessarily the only violation of the Constitution the FBI does. There are plenty warrantless searches the FBI does, totally absent of the
Okay.
NSA. But
We
second of all, and far more importantly, this is what the reality is. If the affirmative happens, the FBI isn't just going to give up on their mission they've been trying to do for 5 decades.
Okay.
What they will do is they're going to try to find a better way to fill into that surveillance. And what
Great.
we are telling you, it is comparatively better to have an
Okay.
AI or computer collecting intelligence because it does not have as
Okay.
many preconceived notions
Why-
against what people should be.
Why does
Let me finish.
that?
Hold
Okay,
on.
you've spent a while. Why does this justify allowing this to continue? Even
Because
if
it's
this will
not-
continue overall. Why
Yeah,
does
no,
this justify the program?
because
right now?
because here's the thing. What we do in a debate round, we should look at the world after you do the affirmative. And if the world after we do the affirmative just results in worse racial crackdowns because now we're allowing police to use their own subjective racial biases in policing as opposed to trusting a computer to do it comparatively less racistly, then we should obviously know that the world after is worse than the world before. Just saying the world is not great now does not justify doing something that makes it considerably and quantifiably worse. That's gross.
As soon as I get back, I'll take the rest of our prep. Is it about 55 seconds? Okay, taking prep. Wait, real quick, pausing prep at 27 seconds. Can you send us the Meyer card that I asked for before?
Yep.
Sorry, I forgot to remind
Yeah,
you.
Mayor.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, yeah. Okay. I just sent Mayor.
As soon as we get it, we'll resume prep. We'll have 15 seconds left, or 20 seconds, sorry. Okay, we got it. Resuming prep as soon as I use. All right. Is everybody good? Awesome. Then I will begin. There are two voters in this debate. The first is how NSA surveillance is critical. How NSA surveillance leads to abuse of power. Throughout this round, Judge, we maintain the idea that law enforcement agencies are able to query the NSA database and use that to conduct investigations. But then when these investigations go to court, they don't reveal where the information came from, namely the NSA. That's extremely problematic, as our Human Rights Watch evidence specifies that when the NSA is able to enable other agencies like the FBI to do this, they use it in a discriminatory process. And in the future, are also able to create discriminatory programs that can be used with no check on them whatsoever, because nobody knows where the information comes from. Essentially, they make one response in summary, which is that the FBI, the DEA, and other agencies conduct have similar processes. However, they flow through ink. The first thing that we say is that even if injustice is still occurring, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't end discrimination as much as possible. At the point where they don't prove that discrimination is occurring from these other agencies, but more than that, they don't prove that ending this process is not going to end some amount of discrimination, you should always affirm based on the idea that the FBI right now is utilizing the NSA database 80 times more than the NSA actually is. At that point, you know when you affirm the resolution, you're going to be stopping a large amount of discrimination overall. But then, the second voter in this debate is how NSA surveillance is critical to protect cybersecurity. What we maintain throughout this round is the idea that you don't just have the NSA looking at critical infrastructure. You also have other agencies like the Cyber Command. As mentioned in some of their other evidence, like their Miller evidence, which is talking about critical infrastructure and the need to protect that. At the point where their other evidence talks about how the NSA and other agencies are really, really impossible, the overall idea that other agencies are also involved in this process and that it's not just the NSA on their own means that we're not going to see a crazy attack on the power grid because our adversaries are still deterred by the idea that we have a vast majority of agencies looking into this process. At the end of the round, you're always going to affirm, because when you affirm, you're guaranteed to stop a large amount of discrimination that's occurring right now in the status quo, whereas if you negate, you might potentially stop some cyber attack. Thus, we urge you to affirm.
We're going to call and run the rest of our prep. Starting. Okay. Is everyone ready? So the order of my speech is just going to be doing some comparative at the top, and then moving on to the first voter of our argument about cybersecurity, and then the second voter about discrimination in the Constitution. Okay. Here's why, even if you buy that the NSA violates constitutional laws and their entire case, we are still winning the round. Firstly, the reason that we value the Constitution and the rights they're talking about is because we think it's the best vehicle to protect security. If we prove that we better preserve security and the lives of Americans, vote for us. Don't vote for the Constitution just to uphold the paper that it's on. But secondly, we are going to link in and worsen their impact through ours. If the power grid shuts down as a result of the lack of cybersecurity, that would cause mass pandemonium across the United States, and it would mean that the FBI and the CIA and all these other agencies have more justification and ability to violate the rights of American citizens when they go in the paranoia. But our cyber attack argument goes vastly uninteracted with. We are telling you that our Mayer evidence from case says that the NSA is the only agency able to attribute cyber attacks to their source, which is through tracking telecommunication cables. And therefore, they create this deterrence effect, because if they're able to attribute it to their source, then malicious actors like Russia fear shutting down our power grid. On the other hand, when you take that away, that leaves Russia free reign to go in and shut down our power grids. Their only response is that the Cyber Command will step in. We have a few responses that go unengaged with. Firstly, even if the Cyber Command cooperates with the NSA, the data that they use in the first place comes from the NSA. Cyber Command will be completely helpless without it. But secondly, this is a wholly ahistorical argument. With their own SolarWinds example, the Cyber Command was completely overwhelmed and the NSA was the agency that attributed to it. Every piece of history points to the neg. And if you let the power grid be shut down, 9 out of 10 Americans will die because food production and food storage will all halt. But the second voter also flows to our side, because the problem here is that they're missing the comparative. The principle of discrimination is not a reason to affirm if it data doesn't stop discrimination in the real world. We told you that NSA data is not critical to this database. The FBI, the DEA, and countless other agencies contribute to it and will continue contributing to it even without the NSA. And this will also go into court without being able to disclose the source. So look to history. The FBI violated rights way before the NSA. But what the NSA does is provide data for algorithms that reduce racism and reduce discrimination. So ultimately, you're not going to be sacrificing millions of lives for the Constitution, and ultimately, you're going to be negating.
Thank you guys. Good round.
Hey, guys.
Sound y'all.
I just want to confirm, it's too late to like call an evidence challenge. That has to be before the profile focus, right?
I'll check the rule.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if it had to be called during the round. Thanks for checking, Cody.
Sorry, what piece of evidence are you challenging? I'm confused.
Just real quick, I'll just say what the rule says. Page 6, rule, or it's line number 7 under section F, says that I just lost it. Subpoint B, debaters are responsible for the authenticity of evidence they present in rounds and shall allow the opposing team or debater to examine evidence introduced in the round. Any challenges to the authenticity of evidence must be made by the debaters during the round or at the conclusion of the second affirmative rebuttal, which is specific to policy because we don't call it affirmative rebuttal, but I think that they mean summary in terms of public forum.
Okay.
So there is or there isn't a challenge? There's not, just to clarify.
I don't
Judge.
think a challenge was made at the conclusion of the second, or at the conclusion of the summary.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it would actually be at the conclusion of just the second summary speech
Yep.
in terms of public forum, because the speeches are all different. So that would be my analysis of it, and I think the other judges are nodding in agreement.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
We just leave now to do our ballot, right?
I was going to ask, I didn't know what the process was.
Oh, correct. I believe they're doing another meet where they disclose everything and say who's going to the final round. So I do not believe everybody has to stay in here. I can check the schedule quick though. Quick click.
Down. So as far as
Yep. So the announcement will be made at 4.
Okay. Thank you all for judging.
All right.
Sound, you guys.
Thank you.
As it's, I'm assuming, just the fact that especially when you have a lot of figures, let me take 15 minutes. A little easier than 5.
We're all good, right?
Yep. We're gonna
Okay.
finish all of our ballots off.
Perfect. Yep. I just need to claim back this room for